Are we ready to go, Abigail? Very good. Thank you. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our latest Con Home panel entitled More to Give. Why does Britain lag behind on philanthropy? And I'm very happy to say that we're doing this today in partnership with the Charities Aid Foundation. My name is William Atkinson. I'm the assistant editor of Conservative Home. And I'm very pleased today to say that I am joined by Neil Heslop, who is the CEO of the Charities Aid Foundation, Joe Gideon, who is the co-chair of the Charities and Volunteering APPG, Damien Green, who amongst a long and storied political career is a member of the GCMS committee, and next to me is Baroness Stahl, who is, again, amongst a long and very political career, the former chair of the Charity Commission. And so the reason why we're having this conversation today is that the UK risks being left behind on philanthropy. Whilst the United States, for various obvious reasons, leads the way, and there are countries such as Ireland and Australia which are working on national strategies to encourage and unlock greater levels of philanthropy. And yet research from the CF has shown that actually fewer people in the UK are giving, that actually charitable donation has fallen by 26% over the last decade. And for a nation that prides itself on being a particularly philanthropic one, this is clearly a status quo that cannot be allowed to hold. So what we'll be focusing on today is how we can encourage greater levels of giving, both individual and corporate, and the role that governments and indeed various other sectors have in facilitating that. But I shan't be harping on for too long. I'm sure you're pleased to hear. But the way that we're going to approach this is that I'm going to ask each of our panelists for a sort of 3 minutes or so opening speech. I will ask a few questions, and then I will throw it over to you in the audience to raise your concerns, questions, issues, though I would, of course, say an obvious term applies, which is that no monologues, please. We do have, and I hope, several questions to get through, so if we can actually focus on a question rather than a monologue, that would be very good. So without further ado, Neil, can you kick us off, please?
Okay, well, thank you, and good evening, everyone, and thank you to Conservative Home, thank you to our other panelists for joining us here this evening. Just by way of introduction, Charities Aid Foundation, I guess the clue's in the name. We're a foundation that exists to aid charities. We're actually the largest UK charity by income and nearly 100 years old. The organisation's purpose is to accelerate progress in society towards a fair and sustainable future for all. And the way that we seek to fulfil that purpose is in 3 ways. Firstly, in terms of advocacy and research work, where we seek to collaborate across sectors and borders, really to try to contribute to the debate, to inspire the kind of innovations so that civil society as a whole may thrive. And I guess that's the essence of why we're here, and really interested to have this conversation today. The second way that we make a contribution is that we partner with donors, encouraging them to give more and supporting them to do so with the greatest impact possible. Last year, that was to the tune of £1 billion, distributed to the better part of 200,000 organisations in 120 countries. And then lastly, we provide direct enablement work in support of charities to help them to do more of their own life-changing work with lasting benefits for all of us. And we do that by operating a specialist bank, an investment house, in order to support them to use their resources most effectively. The whole question of philanthropy policy is not one that is traditionally very high on the public agenda, but we think at this point in our history it's important that it is raised up and put on people's agenda, really because we're at a very important point in the sector's history. A number of the things that we've seen in recent years really feel like they're becoming very entrenched. William talked about some of them in terms of the giving population. We have a smaller and smaller proportion of our society giving on a regular basis. Payroll giving is in decline, and that stat that William mentioned about corporate giving having declined some 26% in the last 10 years. And for the very long term, and for the communities that we all want to live in, we think that poses some really serious challenges for us as a society. Traditionally, we've always been a leader with respect to philanthropy, but we are and have found ourselves somewhat falling behind other countries like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Ireland. And there are some very interesting things going on in those geographies that perhaps give us a few clear clues as to the kinds of things that we might like to consider here in the UK. For example, the Australian government have actually set out and set themselves the very bold, ambitious target of doubling philanthropy by 2030. So it's our belief at the Foundation that the government should consider bringing forward a national strategy for philanthropy and charitable giving. And we put forward a set of ideas and policy recommendations really for 5 areas that we think have the potential to be explored. Individual giving, workplace giving, and place-based giving. We also think that a couple of other areas are worthy of consideration in terms of really thinking through where in governments charity policy and execution actually takes place. And for such a large and fragmented sector, data is hugely challenging but hugely important. Those 5 areas are those that we think should form the basis of what policymakers should be thinking about in the months and years ahead. That's all I was hoping to say, Will.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Neil. That's a very good way of teeing us off. Jo, can I ask for your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. So I think that in Britain we have a different attitude to wealth and therefore to philanthropy. We don't praise the wealthy for donating. We criticise them for being so wealthy. And that is a fundamental problem, I think, that sits deep within our culture. I represent a red wall seat, and I've always been very clear to say that in Stoke-on-Trent, where we have some of the poorest communities in the country, people don't resent the wealth of the highest taxpayer in the UK, which is the Coates family. So Bet365's headquarters is in Stoke Central, because there is a connection within the community of the good that they do, but also the local connection is incredibly important. So the Coates family 20 years ago were running a very small number of bookies in the high street and flipping burgers outside Stoke City Football Club. And today they own Stoke City Football Club, the highest taxpayers. They also donate to multiple charities, helping young people, several hundred bursaries to young people to go to university. Most recently, young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. So there is a lot of good work, and I do think that I would join the call for a more positive approach to philanthropy within government, and possibly even a minister for philanthropy, because I think that we need to harness the good, not just of local people made good who want to give back to their local communities, but I do think that is a really important place to start. And again, to give the example of Stoke-on-Trent, the rival football club, Port Vale, is owned by Carol Shanahan, and she's an amazing individual who's harnessed 150 individual wealth holders in the city to plug into the Made in Stoke network. So there is this remarkable, I think, diaspora of people who just care about the city and really want to make a difference. Whether that translates itself into having the right match to government. I had a conversation earlier about the fact that things like levelling up funds, that government hasn't actively sought to match government funding with charitable giving. and the whole idea of match aid, I think, would be a very powerful one at a time when government is strapped for cash and the community is strapped for cash, but combined together, it gives both a combined purpose, also the direction of where the money is best placed, and I think probably the same applies to corporate giving, because quite often corporates will say, well, we want to give, but we care about environmental charities, or so to kind of harness the best way of giving and enable in a way that benefits the most disadvantaged communities, I think is really important. I do a lot of work as well around access to finance, and I think CDFIs have got a role in this space as well. So it's really about pulling everybody together that can help the great work of the third sector through partnership working. And so that would be my key message as to how we need to move forward.
Very good. Thank you very much, Jane. That was very interesting, also especially for the folks from your own constituency. I found that very insightful. Damien, your turn.
Thank you. Others on the panel are much more expert than me on the details of charity policy, so I want to provoke, I hope, some thoughts with some broad points. And being mathematically minded, I thought we've got 3 minutes, so I'll make 3 points. The discussion so far has revolved entirely around money, and we can all devise, and indeed government does use, some schemes to encourage rich people or corporates to give more through tax breaks. Now, many of these are admirable, but they are all pushing water uphill, not just because we have a higher tax society than we had before, but certainly structurally and over the long term, a higher tax society than the USA, which is held up as the exemplar of good charitable giving, good philanthropy. And we don't have the same culture. And the culture is something that is developed over decades, not over years. But it is an observable fact that individuals, particularly successful individuals in the USA, feel an instinctive obligation that because they've done well out of the way their society is run, and more specifically, because often they've done well because of their association with a particular institution, very often their school or university, they will support them for the rest of their lives, and they will feel that almost as an instinctive duty. And you can't sort of develop instinct by legislative fiat. So if we want that kind of culture, we're not only going to become a much lower tax society with all the implications that has about public services and what we expect from a welfare state, but also change our attitude to the institutions that we go through in our lives. And the sort of slightly gloomy thought I have, my second point, is that all of that has got worse since COVID. During the pandemic, people got used to the state both ordering them round more than ever before, since before anyone in this room was born in the Second World War, but also, on the other side, doing everything for them, effectively paying millions of people 85% of their wages for sitting at home because the government told them to sit at home. And there is, I accept, a degree of irony in this, in that people thought the state had both the duty and obligation and capacity to do more than it had done before, even though during that period charities big and small were performing absolutely heroic acts in keeping their local communities going, and in particular supporting people who were very, very vulnerable. But the underlying thought that the government is there, is always there, and needs to be there and should be there, inevitably leads to a higher tax society. And that in itself, at the extreme, and I'm going to quote one person anonymously who told me once, as a friend of mine, in the extreme, that basically there is something slightly wrong about the philanthropic impulse. And it sounds very, very strange, and I think it's very, very strange, but a friend of mine, a highly intelligent guy whose politics were of the left, once told me that he didn't like giving to charity because almost always when he did it, he thought the state should be doing this. It's the state's moral obligation to support this particular unfortunate person or institution or animal or whatever. Now, I think that's wrong, but I think the sort of basic impulse that lies behind that is sadly stronger in Britain today than it has been in my adult lifetime, and we will need to challenge that if we want to become a more philanthropic society. My third thought is a more cheerful one, which is that we need to extend the debate beyond simply the provision of money to charities and people with philanthropic impulses, because while people are squeezed in terms of the money they've got at the moment, what more and more people have more and more of is time. And that's particularly true of older people who are fitter for longer and who seek and ought to have some kind of purpose in later life. But it's also true of others as well. And that use of time for charitable volunteering is absolutely ideal for today's fit 60, 70, 80 something. You know, Angela Rippon is high kicking on Strictly at the age of 78. She should serve as an example to everyone that they should be getting out there and doing something useful. They are not old and decrepit just because they're over 70. And I think plugging in to that time availability, it would be, I would modestly suggest adding to Neil's point about the points he wants in a national strategy, that actually we ought to have a national strategy to encourage people to do this, to use their time for charitable purposes, and that in itself will help make up for some of the absence of the available money that we might like to see in other circumstances. Thank you.
Splendid. Thank you very much, Damien. And finally, Baroness Dow.
Thanks, Will. So I want to talk about the role of charities themselves in creating the right conditions for people to be charitable in their giving, or to encourage greater philanthropy, and also to raise what I see as a worrying divergence in public trust when it comes to charities, and the potential risk of that as far as where the picture that we're now seeing in sort of fewer people donating to charities. And if I may, just to refer to the most recent CAF annual giving report, Neil's forward says in there quite clearly that giving starts with trust. And I agree with that. And it's also noted in the most recent CAF report that it's sort of slightly passing reference to the fact that public trust in charities is stabilising, because there had been a dramatic fall in 2016 after some very bad scandals amongst big charities. But there remains a difference between what people feel by way of terms of trust between, in the CAF report, it talks about ABC1s having a higher rate of trust for charities versus C2DEs. Now, as Will has said, I used to be chairman of the Charity Commission, and when I took over in 2018, public trust in charities was at an all-time low at that point. And the then CAF report on giving said that there had been a steady decline in giving since 2016, with fewer people donating. So this is now something which I don't know whether it started in 2016 in terms of this drop, but certainly we've seen a drop-off since then. And I don't have any hard evidence to show a sort of cause and effect, but I am pretty sure that people's trust in charities, and when I say that, I think it's very much driven by their views of the larger, bigger name national type of charities, that is affecting some people's propensity to give. And in the latest Charity Commission annual report on public trust, which goes into much greater detail on this versus the CAF report for obvious reasons. And I should just by the way say that the Charity Commission has a statutory objective to increase public trust in charities. So that's one of the reasons why they do focus on this to the extent that they do. And what their latest report shows is that amongst the lower socioeconomic groups that might be described as blue-collar, living in non-urban, more sort of former industrial towns or market towns, that their rate of trust in charities now is at 40%, which is 30% lower than highly educated, more prosperous individuals who will live in city and cosmopolitan areas. Now, what's also quite striking is the difference in these two different demographic groups is that the lower socioeconomic group will be much more trusting of smaller charities, whereas the converse is true of the more wealthier. Now, that difference is not new, as in there's always been a tendency for people who are less well off to feel much more comfortable with smaller charities where they can see more evidently where the money that they are donating is going and the impact that these charities are having in their local area. But it seems from the evidence that the Charity Commission has collected over the last few years that is becoming increasingly so. And the other difference, which I think is quite interesting, bearing in mind that you would expect people in the lower socioeconomic groups to feel a greater sense of importance of the role of charities, that there's a 30% difference in their view as to whether charity is actually important in society today. Now, the reason why I'm highlighting this divergence is because those who have lower trust in charities are influenced so much by the big name charities, the more national brands of charities, that I think it's even more important that these larger charities recognise their responsibility for upholding the reputation and brand of charity as a whole, and because they are often sort of national charities that have a sort of universal appeal to them. They're promoting and supporting causes that they're not divisive causes. They might be to do with children or sort of birds or whatever the case may be. That it's even more important in this potentially diverging picture, which I think is quite worrying, that they are conscious of not making that divergence worse and staying out of contentious debates where it is leading some people to feel sort of less confident in the charitable sector. So I think I raise that because I want to sort of reinforce what has been said by others on the panel. The charities in the UK do an incredible amount of important good work. The role that they play is becoming increasingly important in that they are having to or being called upon to do things which in the past might have been done by the state. I mean, I agree with Damien's view, but I think that there's also sort of sometimes a greater demand on charities than ever before. So I think if we want to encourage more charitable giving, and we want that to come from everybody in a suitably proportionate fashion, not just the wealthy, then I think it's important that the charity sector too, and particularly those big, important and powerful members of the charity sector, understand their responsibility to maintaining the conditions that are going to make it possible for this very important and vital part of our national life to continue.
Thank you very much. So we've heard from each of us there, and I think there is an element of understanding that the UK is doing well in some areas when it comes to philanthropy, and we can all point to particular examples of both good and bad practice. But there's the sense now, and I think a few panelists have raised it, that if other countries are starting to outline say, national strategies, or actually think of philanthropy as something that is deserving of a minister, that brings, of course, the obvious question, I should say, of what is the role of government in encouraging charitable giving. And now, not to sound, too sceptical, I'll put on my Ronald Reagan / Liz Truss hat here, but what is the actual job or what is the actual role, that the UK government, the UK state, can actually play in encouraging both individual and corporate giving? So what is actually the role that we are looking here for the government to play in encouraging charitable donations? Can I start with Neil, and then any other members of the panel who have an interest or an idea about this, feel free to contribute afterwards. But Neil, what is it you're looking for the government to actually do?
I think it is to see the sector in its entirety for the potential that it offers. What I mean by that is that we talk about it as the third sector. Fundamentally, when we think so much of the challenges that we as a society face, it is about growth. The heavy lifting for growth in the economy must and will always come from the business community, complemented by the second sector in terms of public services. But the third sector, we feel, it is very often invisible in economic terms, in the sense of complementing and amplifying some of the improvements in society. And if you look at, for example, colleagues at Pro Bono Economics, as to the economic effect of the third sector, there's nearly 1 million people employed by charities. The actually scale of the activity economically, when put together with what Joe talked about in terms of partnership, has, we believe, much greater potential than we have yet fully realised. And part of that is because in the way that government operates, that connection between its economic contribution is very, very difficult to recognise in government stats. I think the second thing I would add to that is that when we talk about the sector, there is a huge amount of misunderstanding. There are, in round numbers, 170,000 registered charities in England and Wales. The vast majority of them are small, community, volunteer-led organisations, the point that Damien made about time. And the stat that I always find extraordinary is that something between 85 and 90% of all of those organisations have no employees at all. So we've got this very, very disparate connection at a local and community level. And yes, in what Baron Stowell is talking about, in terms of the disproportionate effect in people's minds of the very, very large, well-known branded charities. And so that is a lot of complexity. And we think that where there is a real tops-down focus on understanding the sector, positioning it coherently, economically and socially, alongside the private and public sectors, other parts of the world are generating an impact that we ourselves are not yet doing, and therefore we think we should be looking to some of those parts of the world to take inspiration for how the lessons, and I think Damien's point about culture in America is well made. 1.37% of American GDP goes in philanthropy. In the UK, it's 0.52, and there are massive differences between those extremes. But if we were to look at economies and cultures that are perhaps more analogous to ours, perhaps Canada or New Zealand or Australia, they're achieving 0.72, 0.75. That difference is seen both in terms of engagement at a community level, that time equation, and it's also seen in terms of hard resources that are then deployed. So that's...
Well, that was very comprehensive, as one would expect. But Jo, did you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, so I have a thought about the sustainability of charities, and I think that it's often been criticised government that government tend to fund projects. They tend to fund short-term pilots, and then the funding for something longer term isn't there. And it was mentioned that philanthropists, if they have a connection to this community and institution, will fund in the longer term. And so we need that mixture of both government helping in the short term, but that longer term funding. And I know a lot of charities who are really very seriously worried about their sustainability. Never more so than during difficult times.
And we're not just talking in a net zero sense here, are we?
We are not talking net zero. We're talking survival. Yeah, I mean net zero has a role to play in the sense that the cost of keeping the lights on is a problem for lots of charities, and so that longer term finance that is not just capital investment, because often government funding is capital, not revenue. And so many charities say, we don't need the building, we need the people in it, and we need to be able to keep on paying the people. And that's something that government has not necessarily done as well as it might.
Damien, do you have any further thoughts?
Two thoughts. First is to pick you up, Will, on you appear to equate Ronald Reagan and Liz Truss. And I would point out gently that Ronald Reagan is one of the most successful political leaders of recent decades, and Liz isn't. The point about what the government could do, which is a central thing. What is it right? Should the government actually be more active? I think it should in trying to encourage, if you like, the sort of charitable sector to be higher in the mix of national discourse. But it's more difficult to think of specific levers. There are obvious financial levers the government could do. It could make it easier to give. It could make it, if you like, less expensive to give for people. It could change corporate law so that tax there could be, if you like, avoided by giving more charitable giving. But I suspect in the long run, it would do better to try and start this change of the culture to make sure that people regarded it as part of their civic duty to do this, and particularly people who have the advantages of financial stability and all of that, and so have something spare to give. And there are many ways in which the government, through its convening power, its power to create publicity, could do that type of thing and just make it part of a national effort that you would help the charitable sector. And it might not achieve anything very measurable very quickly, but I think if you had a consistent push over the years, you could actually change the atmosphere.
To essentially misquote another former US president, ask not what charities can do for you, but what you can do for charities.
All
I
of
suppose is the culture we're aiming to encourage. Baroness Stell, did you have any further thoughts on?
Well, I mean, I'm all for the wealthy being encouraged to donate a greater proportion of their wealth to charities, and if there's more that can be done to make that happen, I'm all for it. I suppose, I think we shouldn't forget. I know this is a slightly different thing, but I mean, things like gift aid. I mean, there's a huge amount that happens now. I mean, I think that I don't know whether Neil's got them. I don't have the statistics to hand in terms of how much is generated for charities through gift aid every year, but it's an enormous amount of money.
1.3 billion.
1.3 billion.
And about 500 million goes unclaimed because of the friction in what is basically a paper-driven system, which if it were digitised within the existing giving, there's another $500 million right now.
Right, okay. Well, I mean, there's that exists already. Now, I mean, gift aid is something, though, that is itself sometimes contentious. I mean, not there are some people who question whether gift aid should continue in the way that it does, because what that is money that would otherwise go into the Treasury coffer and be distributed to public services. Money which is lost, but it exists. It's there, and I think that more should be said and awareness should be made. For people that is a sort of a fantastic support that isn't a direct government sort of isn't sort of policy as such in terms of a policy change like the way in which Neil is talking, but it's a massive thing. I suppose the other thing I would say, to be sort of slightly sort of controversial, I suppose, is that I think with the one thing I would say to the government, which is not necessarily about giving, but I do think back to my point about maintaining what people understand about charities, is that they shouldn't rush to try and make everything a charity. I think there's been a trend over the last 20 years to turn things that might be a public service that is directly funded by the taxpayer into something which is a charitable thing, and I don't think that necessarily helps. I don't think it helps distinguish in people's mind the difference and distinctiveness of charity, which is, again, I think important to generating people's confidence to giving. If I give you one example, there's a new thing called Secure Schools, which is what we might have called in the past borstalls, but under sort of a new approach. This is a new sort of approach to dealing with young offenders in a way which is sort of much more about education rather than necessarily about punishment. And when this was first introduced as a policy idea, the government at the time was keen to make that a charitable function, as it were. Now that's something which is locking people up when they've broken the law is a job for the state. It's not a job for charities. It's not something that we should try and convert into a charitable purpose. And I just think sometimes if I was saying anything to the government, it would be to be careful about the eagerness that there is sometimes to try and sort of make charity a sort of solution to everything, because I don't think it is.
Very good. Well, I think that's very interesting, and I do hope our prisons haven't deteriorated to the stage where we're now having to hand it over to charities to actually run them for us. But who quite knows? But I think that's a very interesting array of responses to the role of the state, and I hope if anybody can grab Jeremy Hunt in the bar of the Midland Hotel later, I think that big gift aid point is perhaps something that should be raised with him, because that sounds like a very easy change that we should make that would do an awful lot of good. But I think it's about time that we asked some questions from the audience. So if you have got a question, as I say, you're way ahead of me. Put your hand up, please. And I think this gentleman here in the end was first to have his hand up. So
Cameron's coalition government particularly made massive progress on delivering legislation like the Localism Act 2011 and then the Social Action, Responsibility and Heroism Act, which reduced regulatory burdens, often on voluntary-led community causes. Just wondering, in that context, what opinions would be on exempting organisations which are registered with the Charity Commission from the Lobbying Act, which stops them speaking out on important issues for fear of falling foul of compliance?
very interesting point. Neil, do you have any particular thoughts on that? Or should I,
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge controversial debate about campaigning charities, and I think, which in my view is very often overblown. The vast majority of charities are not engaged in campaigning work. Is your question really about those larger charities who have then contracted for public service contracts and being required to sign up to what have been perceived as gagging clauses? Is that what you're getting at?
I know that that's an issue, but no, it's more that if an organisation is registered as a charity, they're already meeting a criteria, and therefore they're not engaging in what would be seen as pecuniary lobbying, and it just seems that it's just another piece of red tape that's imposed on them, when really we should be letting them get on with what they're doing, because if they weren't behaving in that way, then they would be deregistered, right? So it just seems like it seems wrong. It seems discordant with the spirit of what charities do to have them bound by a lobbying act.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is probably quite a case, given the huge diversity of different organisations, for a hard look at the categorisations of different organisations under charity regulation. If you look at the United States, and while everyone talks about 501(c)s, actually, when you dig into their regime, there are multiple entities that seem to capture a much greater degree of diversity. So I think the less regulation, but in some cases more specifically tailored regulation for the diversity of different organisations is something that I think in the very long run is likely to be helpful.
Very good. I think fortunately we have both a former member of a Cameron government and indeed Charities Commissioner sat next to me. So do you have any thoughts on this, Brad?
Well, I mean, all I was going to say is, the law permits charities to campaign in pursuit of their charitable purposes. So that is perfectly permissible, and that is something that they are allowed to do. The way in which they do it is important, though, because if charities become indistinguishable in their campaigning approach to, say, a political party or an activist group, then they undermine their own reputation, and then they start to impact the reputation of the brand of registered charity which they are a part of and which they are relying on in terms of the credibility that then allows people to donate to them and indeed to others. So I think that the criticism of the Lobbying Act is overblown, and I think it was moderated to a certain extent anyway to deal with. Or I think there was some greater clarification in terms of guidance that came out of the Electoral Commission that dealt with the major concerns when people were confused before and around elections, referendums. So I don't think that is actually a problem.
Joe, you also had some thoughts.
Yes, so a personal experience, which I think the answer to your question, maybe it needs to be looked at. I set up a charity following the death of a toddler in my constituency after swallowing a button battery. And so the charity in her name was to look at the public awareness of button batteries, and to campaign for changes to the law around button battery safety. The Charities Commission's initial response was, you're campaigning, so you can't be a charity. And I said, but, every charity I know campaigns for its own, the only campaigning was to get the law changed because of this particular issue. It required me to go back and get another charity to back the fact that this is what we were going to do. And so I had to jump through a series of loops that, in my mind, were unnecessary. We got the charitable status, but whether it was because I was an MP and the thought that an MP can't act in a charitable way
I hope not.
on behalf of a cause.
I hope not.
One would hope not, but so yes, I think there is an issue as to how it's judged. How campaigning is judged.
Very good. And Damien, I think you were saying.
Final sort of quick thought on this is, I mean, I very much agree with what Tina said, and I think there's an important point of principle that if being a charity gives you certain tax advantages, then effectively, if you become a campaigning organisation, then which quite often is about you need to spend more money in this area, then I'm slightly uneasy about the thought that, as it were, my tax money is being spent by somebody trying to persuade other people that they should spend more of my tax money on their particular cause, which may well be very worthy. But I think the underlying point is that if charities start campaigning in a way that annoys enough people on either side of a controversial issue, then confidence in charities goes down, and if people start having a bad view of charities, then charitable giving goes down. And I suspect one of the reasons behind the long decline we've seen is actually some of the scandals that have affected charities, particularly in the international field. But another one may well be that people feel that the charitable sector bits of it flirts with being too politicised in a way that, as I say, inevitably when you do that, one or other side of the political spectrum is going to be put off.
Yes, quite. I think for our next question, can we have the lady on the end of the row here?
Thanks very much. So I'm Vic Rayner from the National Care Forum, so working with not-for-profit care providers, many of whom are charities. So you asked the question, William, about what can the government do in terms of encouraging philanthropy, both local and sort of at larger scale. So I've got three suggestions, one of which is perhaps a bit of an explanation to Baroness Stoll's point about the disparity between level of trust at higher income and lower income. And my suggestion would be thinking very carefully and clearly about how local government particularly can continue to support charitable organisations that work in its VCSE sector, even in times of extreme austerity, because I suspect the lower trust in charities is not necessarily a trust in the charitable organisation, but a trust that the services that are needed for those sectors will continue to be delivered. And if you think about what's happened in the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of local services provided by charities, whether it's Age UK or whether it's other volunteering and befriending societies, which have disappeared. And so I suspect people are anxious about that level. So some sort of protected investment in that VCSE sector that is ring-fenced and protected in a way that means that those services continue to operate for organisations, I think, would be one element of that. The second would be around, at a national level, a more strong focus on something like the Social Value Act, which is clearly articulating the extra contribution. And I think when we start...
Madam, sorry, I'm sorry to be a pain. It's just, I know I want to get a few other questions in, so could we...
The last point would be about the kind of themes that are coming along the horizon, so particularly about ageing. Damien mentioned ageing. It's a massive area. I think there's a lot of people who are thinking that they want to make a lot of money out of ageing populations, and I do think philanthropists might think very positively about supporting charitable aims and organisations that will enable people to age with dignity and respect and not find themselves at the sharp end of people who want to extract profit from them.
Thank you. Is there any of the panellists who'd like to particularly sort of comment on that? I think that was actually a very good explanation of various elements of the issue. But in that case, I will move on to this lady here.
Janet Fisher, Chief Exec of Live Music Now. I guess my question is where can government, and we really would support a philanthropy policy, where can government be part of, I guess, a cultural change in helping charities to come together under cause-based approaches? I know, Joe, that in Stoke you have NPAC working to pull together arts and cultural charities through Sir Vernon Ellis, who we're very fortunate is our chair. How can we work together to be able to pull charities from a much broader point of view into the philanthropy, individual giving, and corporate space, given that philanthropy is largely the conserve of larger charities who have, let's take, for example, the Royal Opera House, a development department of 30 people. That, by comparison to a local dementia choir who has a development department of 0.1 of a person, is going to have a very different aspect. So how can government get involved in cause-based approaches? And I guess the other question when you talk about corporate, which is a completely separate issue, is where is FCA, Financial Conduct Authority regulations in, that bringing in around international money laundering and I guess, kickbacks to donors instantly decimated the amount of support that corporations were willing to give to organizations, because it's such a transactional market in a way that philanthropy and individual giving is different. So where can you be the supporter to convene some of those aspects?
Very good. Joe, would you particularly like to...
Just quick answer. So Grant Finder is a really useful tool, and I don't see why we couldn't have a sort of grant finder for philanthropists if they wanted to identify small organisations in a particular, work in a particular field in a particular part of the country. So it would be a way of them finding the sort of things that they'd like to and you know, it's a two-way street, isn't it?
As another panelist would like to Neil?
Yeah, just on the corporate point, I think there are a number of relatively small, straightforward things that have the potential to make a disproportionately big impact. We recently published an analysis of the corporate giving from the FT 100, and frankly, we were a bit shocked in that. That demonstrated that since 2016, when the data was drawn, that corporate giving has pretty much completely stagnated. Our policy recommendation is that corporations should commit 1%, at least 1% of pre-tax profits, and we should celebrate the fact that probably about a quarter of the FTSE 100 do exactly that, if not more. Sadly, however, in a period where profits have tripled in that period since 2016, corporate giving has absolutely stagnated. So in effect, it is declined by 26% over the last 10 years, and there was a small change that happened in terms of reporting requirements in 2013, where companies were not required to report in a standardised ways, and we can't help but feel that in that 10 years. That change has in some way led to that outcome. So we would be calling upon the government to actually go back and go back to that reporting requirement, because I think where the FT 100 starts, we think a lot of other corporations can follow, and the amounts of money, and I make no apology for talking about the money again, are really incredibly impactful. When you think that those organisations, what we're actually saying is, look, this is only in a profit cent. Invest back in the communities to the tune of a penny in the pound. In order to invest in those people and communities from whence those profits came. We think that's something that most people could get behind, and in the greater scheme of things, would have a dramatic effect.
Very good. I think we have time for one more question. So the lady there just put her hand up.
Hello, I'm Rita. I'm a GP from Wolverhampton, and this is an entirely anecdotal observation, so forgive me if it isn't the wider picture. But when speaking to people and organisations locally, I find that a lot of the scepticism around donating locally seems to be a distrust in the sense that how much or what proportion of the money being donated is finding its way to the intended destination. Now, whether the reason for that dilution is, as you say, corruption or red tape or whatever the reason is, I think that's the core belief, the scepticism that prevents people from donating hard cash money. So could charities do more to be more transparent about that? And how can we present that information in accessible terms to people at the point of donation?
Is there a particular panelist who'd like to speak on that? I think, Stella, you speak a lot about trust.
So, I mean, the sort of basic findings in the Charity Commission's work on all of this is that what drives people's trust in charities is very much what you've just said, as in how much of the money that is being donated is being used on the charitable purposes, that the charity is making a difference as a result of that money, as in, you know, is there any point to this, not just that they're spending the money. And the other critical thing is that, as I said earlier, that the way in which they operate upholds charitable standards. So what people have in their mind when they think in terms of their expectations of conduct and behaviour from a charity versus maybe a business or a political party or whatever, and that everybody who is a registered charity is doing their bit to uphold the brand, and that's particularly important for the big name charities. And one of the reasons why people will often be more trustworthy of local charities is because they will feel that they can see a bit more of where it's happening. As to how it's possible for charities to make that information available, charities will understandably sometimes be a little bit concerned that if you're too crude about some of this stuff, it's people's expectation of an understanding that there are always costs involved, of running a charity, and so some money will always go on things that are not necessarily the kind of the high end stuff in terms of impact. But I think that it's incumbent on charities to be as open and as honest as possible about the tensions that exist in terms of sometimes where they have to invest money in order to create the opportunity to make a difference, not to be defensive about it, to get on the front foot, to show that they know the importance on them of being accountable to the people that they're relying on to do the good work that they want them to do. And the Charity Commission, the online register now has far more information about where money is being deployed. So that says now for every charity, if you look up any charity on the register, it will tell you how many employees there are, how many are earning over 60,000, brackets going all the way up, so you can see that sort of thing. And what they're trying to do all the time is to make sure that everybody has got at their fingertips the information that they may or may not want to see, to sort of just to reassure themselves. But sometimes it's just about the attitude of the charities in showing that they know that people deserve that openness from them and not a sort of defensiveness, and that goes a long way.
Thank you very much. Apologies, I don't think we have any more time for any more questions. But I think in summary then, and in the theme of openness that the Baroness has just highlighted, I mean, one of the things that came through from this year research is that younger people are less likely to give than older people. I know the only regular donation I make is to a penguin charity because I once got it as a present for an ex-girlfriend many years ago and I'm too embarrassed to cancel it. But it strikes me that if these trends, post-COVID and for a variety of other reasons, and we've highlighted that from various scandals to even legislation, are standing in the way of people giving, that the actual lesson we should really take from this is a fundamentally conservative one. Neil highlighted for us that the vast majority of the 170,000 registered charities are small ones, run by people with no particular sort of staff and done out of their own initiative. And what are these if not Burke's little platoons? And if there is a role that the government can play in both encouraging people to give, both encouraging charities to go out there, be open, honest, and improve their own name, but also to encourage individuals not only to give money but to give time, then our charity sector can continue to flourish, and we can actually withhold and indeed improve that national tendency towards philanthropy, which I think of which we're all so proud. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I ask, can you have a hand for our panel? And I thank you very much all for coming. Thank you very much.